when the will revealed the truth, breaking free from my family's expectations. It wasn't just the big tasks that I shouldered, but the small, everyday responsibilities too. If something needed to be done around the house, I was the one who took care of it without being asked. I helped with the chores, solved problems that no one else seemed to notice, and generally made sure everything was in order. My sister would disappear into her world, always wrapped up in something else, leaving me to clean up whatever mess was left behind. She had this charm about her, people gravitated toward her, drawn in by her natural ability to light up a room. It came so easily for her, while I stayed behind, quietly holding everything together. At the time, I didn't think much of it. I accepted it because it was all I knew. I wasn't resentful. After all, it seemed like just how things were supposed to be. My parents never outright said it, but it was clear that I was the responsible one, the one they could always count on. My sister, though, was their pride and joy, the one who could get away with anything. She had the ability to charm her way out of trouble, to slip through the cracks of responsibility with a smile. I didn't resent her for it, how could I? She didn't ask for that treatment. But as I grew older, something inside me started to shift. There were moments, quiet sacrifices that piled up over the years, that began to weigh on me. One summer, for instance, my sister wanted to go to this expensive summer camp. It was something she had dreamed of for months, a chance to escape and explore, to be around other kids. My parents, who were already struggling to make ends meet, could only afford to send one of us. And so, they asked if I would be okay with staying home, letting her go instead. They told me that I was the responsible one, the one who could understand why it had to be this way. I did understand, but that didn't make it sting any less. The disappointment lingered, tucked deep inside me, every time I saw her packing her bags while I stayed behind, a quiet observer of her freedom. That moment wasn't an isolated incident. Over the years, there were countless small sacrifices that built up, each one reinforcing my role as the one who would give up what I wanted for the sake of the family. Birthdays, events, opportunities, so many of them slipped away from me because someone else needed something more than I did. I'd give up my own dreams, my own desires, because it felt like the right thing to do. I didn't want to complain, and I certainly didn't want to cause any problems. It was easier to swallow the hurt and just carry on, to be the reliable one everyone could lean on. As I entered adulthood, the weight of these quiet sacrifices grew heavier. I became the unofficial backbone of the family. My parents faced financial struggles, and I was the one who stepped in to help. I took on extra shifts at work, sacrificed time with friends, and even put my own career ambitions on hold so that I could be closer to home, to make sure they were okay. I sent them money whenever they needed it, without hesitation, because it felt like it was my responsibility to do so. My sister, on the other hand, continued to live her life the way she always had, on her terms. She was off traveling, pursuing her passions, while I stayed behind, shouldering the burdens of the family. I don't want to paint my sister as a villain, because that's not who she was. She had her own way of doing things, and maybe I was too busy holding everything together to understand her perspective. But it became hard not to feel invisible. When things went wrong, when life got tough, I was the one who picked up the pieces. She would check in from time to time, sharing stories of her adventures, but when real problems hit, she was nowhere to be found. It was always me who had to step in, and I was expected to do it without question. Yet when my parents spoke about her, their pride in her was undeniable. Their pride in her was a stark contrast to how they viewed me. Every time they talked about my sister, their faces would light up. They praised her for her charm, her spontaneous nature, the way she could capture anyone's attention with a smile. And I'd sit there, quietly listening, knowing full well that I was the one who kept everything running behind the scenes. It wasn't that they didn't appreciate me, I think, but rather that they didn't seem to notice the extent of what I did. My sister's charm seemed to overshadow the steady, unspoken effort I put in to keep everything from falling apart. I never expected to find the will. I was just helping my parents sort through old papers, organizing things that had been left in drawers for years. It was the kind of mundane task that didn't require much thought, just something to pass the time. But then, as I pulled out an old envelope, my hand froze. Inside, hidden among various documents, was the will. Something about the way it was tucked away made me pause, like it was meant to be ignored. But curiosity got the better of me, and I started reading. At first, I thought I might be imagining things. The document was dry and straightforward, listing out assets and instructions with no fanfare. I skimmed over the first few paragraphs, my eyes grazing the details without truly registering them. But as I continued, the words started to blur together, my heart racing with each line I read. The house, their savings, even the small, sentimental items that had been in the family for generations, all of it was left to my sister. Not a single mention of my name. The shock hit me like a wave, a cold realization that seemed to steal the air from my lungs. I gripped the paper tighter, as if the weight of it could somehow ground me. My stomach churned, a knot forming in my chest. This wasn't just an accidental oversight, it was deliberate. The years of quiet sacrifices, the moments where I had been invisible, suddenly felt like a cruel joke. The life I had built for them, the way I had silently carried the family on my back, it all amounted to nothing. And I was left with nothing. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, staring at the will, trying to make sense of it. Part of me wanted to believe it was a mistake, that maybe the document hadn't been updated. Maybe they'd forgotten to include me. But deep down, I knew that wasn't the case. This wasn't a mistake, this was a decision. A choice that reflected everything about the roles we'd been assigned in this family. My sister, the free spirit, the one who could do no wrong, was the one they wanted to have it all. And I was, once again, the steady force that was overlooked. For so long, I had convinced myself that the family dynamic was just how things were. My sister had her own way of existing, and I had mine. I was the dependable one, the one who took care of everything without asking for anything in return. But reading the will, seeing the cold reality of it all written out, made me realize how much I had been taken for granted. All those sacrifices, all the moments I had given up for the sake of the family, suddenly felt pointless. I wasn't even worthy of a mention in the will. I tried to reason with myself, to find some logical explanation that would make it easier to accept. Maybe they thought she needed more, maybe they thought she would appreciate it more. I tried to justify it in my head, to make it fit into the narrative I had been telling myself for years. But nothing I came up with seemed to make sense. This wasn't about fairness or need, it was about a pattern, a dynamic that had been ingrained for as long as I could remember. And now, it was written in black and white. At that moment, something inside me snapped. The hurt, the anger, and the years of silent frustration all came rushing to the surface. It wasn't just about the inheritance, it was about everything. It was about the way my sister had always been the star, the one who could get away with anything, while I was the one who quietly held everything together. And now, even in death, it seemed like nothing had changed. I was still the invisible one, the one who was never seen for what I had done. I knew I had to confront them, to ask why. But I wasn't prepared for the response. When I brought it up, hoping for some explanation that would ease the sting, my parents' reaction only deepened the wound. They seemed surprised by my reaction, almost as if they hadn't realized how hurtful it was. They told me I was doing fine on my own, that I didn't need anything from them. They said my sister needed more help, that she wasn't as self-sufficient as I was. It was as if my independence, my ability to take care of myself, disqualified me from being considered. Their words felt like a slap in the face. The years of sacrifices, the times I had stepped in to help, the way I had put my own needs aside for the sake of the family, all of it seemed to have been dismissed. I had worked so hard to make sure everyone else was okay, to carry the weight of their problems, and yet I was the one left out. My efforts were not seen as a strength but as something that made me less deserving. It was as though my ability to manage on my own was the reason they had chosen to exclude me. As the days went on, their words echoed in my mind, each time cutting deeper than the last. The anger that I had kept buried for so long began to fester, and I found myself questioning everything. How had I let myself fall into this role? How had I allowed myself to be the one who gave and gave without ever receiving anything in return? I began to resent the quiet sacrifices I had made, the moments where I had set aside my own desires for the sake of keeping the peace. And now, it felt like it had all been for nothing. How had I allowed myself to be the one who gave and gave without ever receiving anything in return? I began to resent the quiet sacrifices I had made, the moments where I had set aside my own desires for the sake of keeping the peace. And now, it felt like it had all been for nothing. But the truth was, I couldn't keep carrying the weight of their choices, of their expectations. Something had to change. I couldn't continue to live in this cycle of giving without ever receiving. For the first time, I realized that I didn't owe them anything. I didn't owe them my sacrifices, my silence, or my ability to carry the load. The realization was painful, but it was also liberating. I could no longer allow myself to be the invisible one in this family. I had to start putting myself first. The weeks that followed were some of the hardest I had ever experienced. It felt like I was walking through each day with a heavy weight pressing down on my chest. I had always been the one to keep things together, to be the glue holding everything in place. But now, I found myself withdrawing, pulling away from my family. I stopped answering their calls, letting them go straight to voicemail. Sunday dinners, which had always been a tradition, became a source of anxiety instead of comfort. I couldn't face them. The thought of sitting at the table, pretending everything was normal, was unbearable. The tension inside me was palpable, and I could feel it in every part of my body. It wasn't just the will, though that had certainly lit the fuse. It was everything, the years of feeling overlooked, undervalued, and invisible. Every time I had sacrificed my own happiness for the sake of the family, it seemed to add another layer to the wall between us. Now, I wasn't sure how to tear it down. My sister, as always, seemed completely oblivious to the storm brewing inside me. She would call, as she always did, to chat about her latest adventures, her dreams, and plans for the future. Each time I spoke with her, it was as if nothing had changed. She mentioned casually selling the house, investing in her passions, without a second thought. I could hear the excitement in her voice, the confidence in her words, and it stung more than I expected. She couldn't know, how much that conversation cut through me. It wasn't just the inheritance, though that was certainly a catalyst. What hurt the most was what the will represented, the years of being taken for granted, of being the dependable one who quietly gave up what they wanted. The way my family had always leaned on me, never seeing how much I sacrificed in the process. It felt like everything I had done to keep things running smoothly, to make sure everyone else was okay, had been ignored, and in its place was a complete disregard for my own needs. I struggled with what to do next. A part of me wanted to just let it go, to try to move forward and not rock the boat further. But deep down, I knew that would only make it worse. I couldn't keep carrying this resentment. If I stayed silent now, it would only fester and grow into something far more damaging. Every time I thought about it, the hurt only seemed to deepen. I knew I couldn't just keep living in this role, accepting the scraps while everyone else got what they wanted. It wasn't just about the money or the house, it was about the years of unacknowledged sacrifices, the way I had always put others' needs first while mine were left behind. It was about the family dynamic that had never given me space to be anything other than the responsible, reliable one. No one ever asked if I was okay or if I had dreams and needs of my own. My entire life had been shaped by the expectations placed on me, and I was beginning to realize how much it had drained me. When I finally sat down with my parents, I knew I couldn't hold back any longer. It felt like the words were trapped inside me, desperate to be said. I didn't want to yell, didn't want to be angry, though I was. I simply wanted them to understand, to see all the things I had done for them without ever asking for anything in return. I spoke about the sacrifices, the countless times I had put their needs ahead of mine, and how it felt to have that go unnoticed. My heart was racing, my hands trembling, but I knew I couldn't back down. Their reactions were not what I had hoped for. My mother looked uncomfortable, as if she didn't quite know how to process what I was saying. My father, on the other hand, grew defensive, trying to justify their actions and the choices they had made. I could see that they didn't fully understand, that they couldn't grasp the depth of my feelings. My sister, when I told her how I felt, dismissed it with a laugh, telling me I was being overly sensitive, as though I was the one who had lost touch with reality. It wasn't the resolution I had wanted, but at least the words were finally out in the open. I had said everything I needed to say, and for the first time in a long while, I felt a small sense of relief. It wasn't the perfect ending, and I knew the road ahead would be difficult. But I also knew that this conversation, uncomfortable as it was, had changed something inside me. I had stood up for myself, for the first time in my life, and that felt like a victory in its own right. After that conversation with my parents, I began to feel something inside me shift. For so long, I had lived my life trying to meet their expectations, trying to earn their approval. It was exhausting. It drained me, both emotionally and physically, to be constantly looking for validation that never seemed to come. I had given up so much of myself for them, and yet it never felt like enough. The weight of trying to be the perfect child had been too much for far too long. The realization hit me like a sudden wave. I couldn't keep living like this. I couldn't keep sacrificing my happiness and my well-being for people who didn't see me for who I truly was. It wasn't fair to myself, and it wasn't sustainable. I started to set boundaries. I said no to things I would have automatically agreed to before, to things I felt obligated to do out of guilt or a sense of duty. I realized that my own life, my own happiness, mattered too. Focusing on my own goals became a priority, something I had long neglected. For years, my life had been about everyone else, their needs, their expectations, their desires. Now, for the first time in a long while, I started to ask myself what I wanted. What made me happy? What did I need to feel fulfilled? I began to reclaim parts of myself that had been buried beneath the weight of others' demands. The process was liberating, but it was also strangely lonely. There were moments when I felt a profound sense of loss. Stepping back from my family felt like losing a part of my identity. I had always been the responsible one, the reliable one. And now, letting go of that role, that place in their lives, left a void I wasn't sure how to fill. It felt as if I was walking away from everything I had known. But I also knew deep down that it was necessary. I couldn't continue living a life that wasn't my own. Months passed, and I stayed firm in my decision to focus on myself. The guilt still lingered, but I pushed through it. Then, one day, I received a call from my parents. They wanted to revisit the will, they said. They wanted to make things fair. At first, I felt a rush of conflicting emotions. Part of me was relieved, glad that they were finally acknowledging me. But another part of me couldn't help but feel skeptical. Why had it taken so long for them to see me? As I thought about it more, the sadness crept in. It wasn't just about the inheritance, but about everything that had led up to this moment. The years of being the dependable one, the one who always did what was expected, had never seemed to matter as much as my sister's charm and spontaneity. Now, they wanted to make it right, but how could they undo all those years of neglect in one simple gesture? Part of me wanted to reject their attempt, to tell them it was too little, too late. But there was another part of me that knew this was their way of trying to make amends. It wasn't perfect, but it was something. I agreed to meet them halfway, but on my terms. I made it clear that my life would no longer revolve around them. I would no longer play the role of the perfect child, the one who gave up everything for the sake of the family. I would take care of myself first, and that was a boundary they would have to respect. The experience changed me in ways I hadn't anticipated. It taught me that my worth is not defined by anyone else's approval. It's not about meeting other people's expectations or living up to their standards. My worth is determined by how I see myself, by the life I choose to create for myself. I no longer feel the need to earn their recognition. For the first time, I understand that I am enough, just as I am. The relationship I have with my parents and sister will never be perfect. There will always be a part of me that longs for their approval, for the connection we once had. But that longing no longer consumes me. I have found peace in knowing that I am not defined by their opinions or their version of who I should be. I am free to live for myself, to prioritize my own happiness and goals. And that freedom, that sense of independence, is worth more than any inheritance ever could be. I feel like I'm standing on my own for the first time in my life. The pressure to be the perfect child, the one who always did the right thing, has finally lifted. I am free to chart my own path, to follow my own dreams. And while it's still a process, I am learning to embrace this new version of myself. I am learning to live for me, and it feels like I've finally found the peace I had been searching for all these years.